Your things are already packed, Ashley Whitmore said calmly, even though Margaret Whitmore had not even stepped inside the house yet. Margaret stood on the front porch of the pale blue suburban home where she had lived for 36 years, her small suitcase still in the trunk of the taxi behind her, and the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the quiet Ohio street. A stack of cardboard boxes sat beside the door, neatly sealed, labeled in thick black marker. Kitchen, winter coats, photo albums. For a moment Margaret simply looked at them, as if they belonged to someone else. 10 days earlier she had left this house in an ambulance, coughing and weak from a stubborn case of pneumonia that had refused to go away. She had expected to come back to silence, perhaps a warm cup of tea, maybe the faint smell of laundry detergent from the clean sheets she always kept folded in the hallway closet. Instead, she found her life waiting outside like a shipment ready to be picked up. The porch wind chime moved softly above her head, a sound she remembered hanging with her husband Edward on a warm summer afternoon decades ago. The memory passed through her mind quietly. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not ask questions. She simply adjusted the strap of her purse and studied the handwriting on the boxes. Ashley's handwriting. Sharp. Efficient. Inside the house, through the screen door, she could see her son Daniel standing near the kitchen counter. He looked smaller somehow, as though the room had grown larger around him. His arms were folded. His eyes avoided hers. Ashley stepped forward with the careful politeness of someone explaining a practical decision. She wore a cream sweater Margaret had given her 2 Christmases ago. Margaret, she said evenly, we thought it would be easier if your things were ready when you got home. The word home lingered in the air with a strange weight. Margaret slowly turned her head and looked at the porch railing where Daniel had once carved his initials with a pocket knife when he was 9 years old. The mark was still there, faint but visible beneath the paint. She remembered the day clearly. He had cried because he thought he was in trouble, and she had laughed and told him some marks were allowed to stay forever. Now the house felt different, as if the walls had quietly shifted while she was gone. A car drove past at the end of the street. Somewhere a lawn mower hummed steadily in the distance. Margaret noticed small things the way people do when something important is already broken and there is no point pretending otherwise. Ashley crossed her arms gently and glanced toward the stacked boxes, then back at Margaret with the faint smile of someone who believed the matter had already been settled. Daniel still said nothing. Margaret's eyes moved from the boxes to the front door, then to the living room window where the lace curtains hung exactly the way she had ironed them months ago. 36 years of mornings, dinners, birthdays, quiet winters, and summer storms lived behind that door. And now, according to the arrangement waiting on the porch, none of it seemed to belong to her anymore. Margaret Whitmore did not touch the boxes right away. She remained standing on the porch for several seconds, her hand resting lightly on the wooden railing that Edward had painted every spring without fail. The paint had faded a little over the years, but the surface still felt smooth beneath her fingers. Behind her, the taxi driver cleared his throat gently, unsure whether he should unload the suitcase from the trunk or simply wait. Margaret glanced back and offered him a polite nod, the kind she had used her entire life when speaking to neighbors, delivery drivers, or anyone who happened to cross her path in the quiet suburb outside Columbus. The driver stepped forward and placed the suitcase beside the stack of boxes without asking questions. Margaret noticed that even the smallest things had been organized with deliberate care. Each carton had clean tape lines. Each label had precise handwriting. Someone had spent time doing this. Ashley folded her arms and shifted her weight slightly, watching Margaret the way a real estate agent might watch a buyer inspect a property. There was patience in her expression, but not warmth. Daniel finally stepped closer to the doorway, though he did not step onto the porch. His shoes remained inside the house, just behind the threshold where Margaret had once placed a welcome mat embroidered with small blue flowers. For a moment it seemed as though he wanted to speak. His lips parted slightly, then closed again. Margaret studied his face quietly. She could still see the boy who had once fallen asleep on the living room couch with a science book open on his chest. The boy who used to run down the hallway on Saturday mornings asking for pancakes. Now that same hallway stood behind him, silent and unfamiliar. Ashley spoke again, her voice calm and steady. She explained that the arrangement was meant to make things simpler for everyone. The house had become crowded, she said. Their family needed space, routines, privacy. Margaret listened without interrupting. She had always been a careful listener. 36 years of marriage had taught her that silence sometimes revealed more than words. Her eyes moved slowly across the porch, noticing details that had once been ordinary. The hanging fern that she watered every morning. The small ceramic bird bath near the steps. The brass door handle Edward had installed after the original one broke during a winter storm. Everything looked exactly the same, yet none of it felt as though it belonged to her anymore. Daniel shifted again inside the doorway and rubbed the back of his neck. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded distant, as if the words had been rehearsed earlier and now came out without strength. He said that Ashley had been thinking about the future. He said that perhaps Margaret would be more comfortable somewhere quieter for a while. The sentence drifted into the warm evening air and faded. Margaret did not argue. She simply bent down and lifted the lid of the nearest box. Inside were neatly folded sweaters, the soft gray one she wore every Thanksgiving resting on top. For a brief moment, she pressed her hand against the fabric, feeling the familiar texture. Then she closed the box again, straightened her back slowly, and looked once more at the house where every window held a memory that only she seemed to remember. Margaret Whitmore closed the lid of the box slowly and rested her hands on the cardboard for a moment, as if measuring the weight of something far heavier than folded sweaters. The porch felt smaller now, crowded not by the boxes but by the quiet that had settled between the three of them. Ashley glanced at her watch briefly, the subtle gesture of someone who believed the conversation had already reached its conclusion. Daniel remained just inside the doorway, one hand touching the frame as though he needed the house itself to keep his balance. Margaret noticed the small habits people revealed when they were uncomfortable. Daniel had always done that when he was a boy, leaning against something solid when he did not know what to say. The wind chime moved again with a soft metallic sound, and Margaret looked toward the maple tree in the front yard. Edward had planted that tree the year Daniel started kindergarten. It had been barely taller than the mailbox then. Now its branches stretched wide across the lawn, casting long shadows over the driveway, where Daniel had once practiced riding his bicycle while Margaret ran behind him with one steady hand on the seat. For a brief moment the memory returned with such clarity that she could almost hear his laughter echo across the pavement. Ashley cleared her throat gently, bringing the present back into focus. She explained again that this arrangement was only temporary, that Margaret would be more comfortable somewhere with proper rest and quiet. She spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded practical rather than cruel. Margaret had heard that tone before in her life. It was the tone people used when they believed kindness could be performed through organization and distance. Margaret nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she understood that arguing on a porch filled with cardboard boxes would change nothing. The taxi engine idled quietly at the curb, the driver watching with the cautious patience of someone who sensed a private moment unfolding in front of him. Margaret stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the first box. The late afternoon air carried the faint smell of freshly cut grass from a neighbor's yard. Everything about the neighborhood looked peaceful, exactly the way it had looked every summer for more than 3 decades. Yet Margaret felt as if she were standing on unfamiliar ground. She lifted one box carefully and carried it toward the taxi. The driver opened the trunk without speaking and placed it beside the suitcase. Another box followed, then another. Ashley remained on the porch, arms folded, observing the process with a calm expression that suggested efficiency rather than reflection. Daniel stepped forward once as if he might help, then stopped halfway across the porch. Margaret did not ask for assistance. She simply continued moving the boxes one by one, each step slow but steady. When the final carton was placed in the trunk, she paused beside the open car door and turned back toward the house. The windows reflected the golden evening light, hiding the rooms behind them. For a moment, she studied the front door where the brass handle caught the sun. She remembered installing that handle with Edward on a rainy afternoon when the old latch had finally worn out. The memory rested quietly in her mind. Margaret then lowered herself into the back seat of the taxi and closed the door with gentle care, leaving the porch, the boxes that had once been her belongings, and the silent figures in the doorway behind her. The taxi pulled away from the curb slowly, its tires rolling over the familiar street that Margaret Whitmore had walked along almost every morning for decades. She sat quietly in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the house grow smaller through the rear window. The maple tree Edward had planted stood tall beside the driveway, its leaves shifting gently in the evening breeze, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The driver glanced at her briefly through the mirror, perhaps expecting instructions, but Margaret did not speak right away. She was looking at the neighborhood the way someone studies a photograph for the last time. The same sidewalks where Daniel had raced toy cars when he was 6. The same mailbox Edward had repainted every spring with patient care. The same quiet street where neighbors waved from their lawns and children rode bicycles in slow circles during summer evenings. Everything remained calm, untouched, ordinary. Yet Margaret felt a quiet distance settling inside her, as though the years she had spent there now belonged to another person entirely. After a moment, she gave the driver a simple address. It was not far, only a few miles across town, but the route carried her past places that held their own small memories. They passed the grocery store where she had worked part-time after Daniel left for college. They passed the little diner where Edward liked to order pancakes every Sunday morning before church. The driver followed the road carefully, unaware that each intersection carried a piece of Margaret's past. She watched the storefronts drift by and noticed how much the town had changed. Some shops had new signs. Others had disappeared completely. Time had been moving forward quietly, while she was busy living inside routines that once felt permanent. When the taxi stopped at a red light, Margaret closed her eyes briefly and pictured the living room of the house she had just left. She could still see the soft yellow lamp beside Edward's old reading chair. She could still hear the faint creak of the hallway floorboards that had always made the same sound late at night. Those small details remained clear in her mind, untouched by the cardboard boxes now stacked in the trunk behind her. The driver turned onto a quieter street lined with small apartment buildings and carefully trimmed hedges. Margaret had chosen this address earlier that afternoon, while sitting in the hospital waiting area, long before she knew exactly what she would find when she returned home. Something in her had sensed the possibility that life might look different when she came back. The taxi slowed and stopped beside a modest brick building with white railings along the second-floor balconies. Margaret looked up at the windows and noticed a warm light glowing behind one of the curtains. It was a simple place, not large, not particularly remarkable, but it was quiet. She opened the car door slowly and stepped out onto the pavement, the evening air cool against her face. The driver began lifting the boxes from the trunk one by one, placing them gently near the entrance. Margaret watched him for a moment, then reached into her purse to pay the fare. As the final box touched the sidewalk, she looked down at the stack of cartons that now held pieces of a life that had once filled an entire house. She placed one hand lightly on the top box, steady and calm, and for the first time since leaving the porch she allowed herself a long, thoughtful breath before walking toward the building door. Margaret Whitmore stood for a moment in front of the small brick building and studied the quiet entrance as the last of the evening light faded across the parking lot. The taxi had already pulled away, leaving the soft sound of distant traffic somewhere beyond the trees that lined the street. 4 cardboard boxes rested beside her suitcase near the door, each one holding fragments of a life that had once filled every corner of a larger home. She lifted the first box slowly and pushed open the glass door with her shoulder, stepping into a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of fresh paint and floor cleaner. The building was modest but carefully maintained. A row of small mailboxes lined the wall, each with a polished number beside it. Margaret noticed the quiet hum of fluorescent lights above and the distant murmur of a television coming from one of the apartments upstairs. It was not the house she had built her life in, but it was calm, and for the moment calm was enough. She carried the first box toward the staircase and paused halfway up the steps, catching her breath not from weakness, but from the weight of the long day that had unfolded without warning. The second-floor hallway was softly lit by a lamp at the far end, and the door to her new apartment waited halfway down the corridor with a small brass number attached beside the frame. Apartment 2B. Earlier that afternoon, while sitting quietly in the hospital waiting room, she had signed the short-term lease with steady hands. The clerk had spoken kindly and offered reassurance about the neighborhood, but Margaret had not needed convincing. She simply needed a place where the silence belonged to her. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, setting the box carefully on the floor of the small living room. The apartment was simple but clean. A narrow kitchen stood along one wall, and a single window looked out over a line of maple trees behind the building. The evening breeze moved their leaves gently, creating the same soft rustling sound she remembered from her old front yard. Margaret returned to the hallway for the remaining boxes, carrying them in one by one with the same quiet patience she had used while packing school lunches and organizing holiday dinners for most of her adult life. When the final box rested inside the apartment, she closed the door and turned the small lock with a soft click. The room felt unfamiliar, but peaceful. She walked slowly to the window and looked outside as the sky shifted toward dusk, the streetlights beginning to glow along the quiet road. For several minutes, she stood there without moving, allowing the stillness to settle around her. The day had taken something from her. That much was clear, yet beneath the exhaustion she felt another quiet realization forming. Houses could change owners. Rooms could fill with different voices. But memory had its own place, one that could not be packed into cardboard boxes or left behind on a porch. Margaret turned back toward the stack of cartons in the center of the living room and rested her hand lightly on the top one, her expression calm and thoughtful as the evening settled gently around the small apartment. Margaret Whitmore did not open the boxes that night. She simply moved them closer to the wall and sat quietly in the small kitchen chair beside the window, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The apartment was silent in a way that felt unfamiliar after so many years of living in a house filled with footsteps, voices, and the soft sounds of everyday routines. She rested her hands on the table and allowed the quiet to settle around her without rushing to fill it. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, and then the neighborhood returned to stillness again. Margaret had always believed that time revealed things gradually, the way sunrise slowly uncovered the shape of a landscape. The events of the afternoon had been sudden, but the truth behind them had likely been forming for much longer than a single day. She stood after a while and walked toward the boxes, kneeling carefully beside the one labeled photo albums. The tape peeled away with a soft sound as she opened the lid. Inside were thick albums filled with years of photographs. Birthday parties in the backyard. Daniel holding a fishing rod beside a quiet lake. Edward standing proudly beside the maple tree when it was still no taller than his shoulder. Margaret turned a few pages slowly, her expression calm rather than sorrowful. Each image felt like a small window into a life that had been real and complete, even if its shape had now changed. After several minutes, she closed the album and placed it gently back inside the box. What mattered most from those years was not stored in cardboard. It lived in memory, steady and clear. Margaret rose and walked to the small desk built into the corner of the living room. The apartment manager had mentioned that the previous tenant had left it behind because it was too heavy to move. The wood surface was slightly scratched but sturdy. Margaret opened her purse and removed a thin folder that she had carried with her since leaving the hospital. Inside were a few papers she had taken from the drawer of her bedside table before the ambulance arrived 10 days earlier. At the time, she had not known exactly why she wanted them close. Perhaps it had simply been habit. Edward had always said that important things should be kept together where they could be found when the moment required it. Margaret unfolded the first document and placed it flat on the desk beneath the warm light of a small lamp. The paper was crisp despite its age. Edward's careful handwriting filled several lines near the bottom. Margaret studied the page quietly, her eyes moving across each word with the patience of someone rereading a familiar letter. Outside the apartment, the evening deepened and the hallway lights clicked on automatically, casting a soft glow beneath the door. Margaret remained at the desk for a long time, reading and then folding the paper again with deliberate care. When she returned the document to the folder, her expression had changed slightly. The calm remained, but now there was also clarity, the kind that comes when scattered pieces finally settle into place. She closed the folder and rested her hand on top of it for a moment before placing it gently inside the desk drawer. The quiet room, holding the stillness of someone who had just remembered something important that others had forgotten. Morning arrived quietly through the narrow window of the small apartment, the pale sunlight spreading across the wooden floor and slowly touching the stack of unopened boxes near the wall. Margaret Whitmore woke early, the way she always had during the years when her mornings began with coffee brewing in the kitchen and Daniel rushing down the hallway before school. The apartment was silent except for the faint sound of birds somewhere outside the building. She sat up slowly in the simple bed she had arranged the night before and took a moment to listen to the stillness around her. It felt different from the quiet of her old house. That quiet had always been filled with familiar rhythms. This one was new, uncertain, but not unpleasant. Margaret walked into the small kitchen and filled a kettle with water from the sink. The metal warmed gradually on the stove while she stood beside the window watching the street below come to life. A man walked his dog along the sidewalk. A delivery truck rolled past the corner and disappeared between the trees. Ordinary movements, the kind that marked the beginning of another day. When the kettle began to hum softly, she poured the hot water into a mug and carried it to the small desk in the corner of the living room. The thin folder still rested inside the drawer exactly where she had left it the night before. Margaret opened the drawer and placed the folder carefully on the desk again. The document Edward had signed years ago lay folded inside, its paper firm despite the passing time. She unfolded it slowly and read each line once more, her eyes steady and thoughtful. Edward had always been a practical man. He believed in preparation, in making sure that important matters were clear long before they were needed. At the time, Margaret had listened to him with mild curiosity as he explained the details to their lawyer across the polished conference table of a quiet office downtown. She had not imagined that those words would one day matter so much. Now they did. Margaret folded the document again and placed it neatly back inside the folder. Her expression remained calm, but there was a quiet certainty in her movements that had not been there the day before. She finished her tea and washed the mug in the sink before returning to the desk. From her purse, she removed a small address book that she had carried for years. Many numbers had been written and crossed out across its pages, but one name remained unchanged near the middle: Harold Bennett. Edward had trusted him with every important document the family ever signed. Margaret turned the page toward the window light and studied the phone number carefully, remembering the last time they had spoken at Edward's memorial service several years earlier. Harold had shaken her hand gently and told her that if she ever needed anything, she should not hesitate to call. Margaret closed the address book and placed it beside the folder on the desk. The apartment remained quiet around her, the morning sunlight growing brighter against the floor. She reached for the telephone on the corner of the desk and rested her hand on the receiver for a moment before lifting it slowly, the calm expression on her face suggesting that the quiet events of the previous day had only begun to unfold. Margaret Whitmore held the telephone receiver quietly to her ear as the line began to ring, the soft mechanical tone echoing through the small apartment. Morning light filled the room now, resting across the wooden desk and the thin folder that remained open beside her hand. For a moment she listened to the distant sound of the ringing, remembering the many years when Edward handled calls like this himself, speaking with calm certainty while she sat nearby with a cup of coffee and the newspaper folded across her lap. After the third ring, a familiar voice answered on the other end. Harold Bennett spoke with the same steady tone she remembered from years ago, professional yet warm, as though time had passed but not altered the rhythm of his voice. Margaret introduced herself quietly, and there was a brief pause before Harold responded with recognition. He remembered her immediately. Edward had spoken of her often during their meetings, and the memory of those conversations seemed to return to him now as naturally as if they had happened only last week. Margaret explained the events of the previous afternoon in simple words, describing the boxes on the porch, the quiet conversation at the doorway, and the moment the taxi carried her away from the house where she had spent most of her life. She did not raise her voice or speak with anger. She simply described what had happened with calm precision. Harold listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished, there was another pause on the line, the kind that comes when someone begins to understand a situation more clearly than the people inside it. Harold then asked a few gentle questions about the documents Edward had prepared years earlier. Margaret glanced down at the folder on the desk and placed her hand lightly on top of it as she answered. Yes, she still had the original papers. Yes, they had been signed in his office. Yes, the property records had been filed exactly as Edward requested. Harold responded with a quiet sound that was almost a thoughtful sigh. He told Margaret that Edward had been very particular about those documents. At the time, Edward had explained that he wanted to protect the house that had been built through decades of shared work and sacrifice. Harold remembered the conversation clearly. Edward had insisted that the ownership remain secure under Margaret's name alone, not as a temporary arrangement, but as a permanent legal structure designed to prevent misunderstandings later. Margaret listened without surprise. Edward had always been careful in matters that involved the future. Harold then spoke again, his tone calm, but now carrying a sense of quiet assurance. He explained that the situation Margaret described was not as final as it might appear to someone standing on a porch with cardboard boxes. According to the documents he still kept in his records, the legal ownership of the house had never changed. Margaret remained the sole owner. Anyone living there did so only with her permission. Margaret sat very still in the chair as she listened to those words. Outside the apartment window, the morning traffic began to move slowly along the street. Ordinary life continuing without pause. Inside the quiet room, Margaret thanked Harold for his time and asked if he would be willing to review the documents with her later that week. Harold agreed immediately and suggested that she bring the folder to his office so they could examine everything together. Margaret placed the receiver gently back onto the cradle when the call ended. The apartment returned to silence once more, but this time the quiet carried a different feeling, one shaped not by uncertainty, but by the calm understanding that some decisions made long ago were now beginning to speak for themselves. Margaret Whitmore spent the rest of the morning moving slowly through the small apartment, placing a few familiar items where they felt most natural. A photograph of Edward stood near the window, its wooden frame catching the sunlight that filtered through the glass. The kitchen remained simple, only a kettle, a mug, and a small bowl resting on the counter, but the quiet space no longer felt temporary. It felt like a place where time could pause long enough for careful decisions to take shape. Later that afternoon, Margaret walked into the office of Harold Bennett, the same office building where she and Edward had once signed documents that seemed routine at the time. The polished wood desk, the tall shelves of neatly arranged files, and the soft ticking of a clock on the wall all felt exactly as she remembered. Harold greeted her warmly and invited her to sit while he reviewed the folder she had carried with such care. He read each page slowly, occasionally adjusting his glasses while confirming the signatures and dates that Edward had insisted upon years earlier. When he finished, he placed the documents neatly back on the desk and folded his hands. His voice remained calm, but carried a quiet certainty. The legal ownership of the house had never changed. Margaret Whitmore was still the sole owner of the property. Anyone living there did so only with her permission. Harold explained that the law was clear and the documents were solid. If Margaret wished, a formal notice could be delivered to the house requiring the current occupants to recognize her ownership and follow the conditions written into the agreement Edward had prepared. Margaret listened carefully, not with anger but with thoughtful attention. She did not rush her answer. She simply nodded once and asked Harold to prepare the notice exactly as the documents required. 2 days later, the envelope arrived at the front door of the house beneath the maple tree Edward had planted decades earlier. Daniel opened it first, standing in the same doorway where Margaret had once found the boxes waiting for her. The letter explained the legal ownership of the property and the conditions written into Edward Whitmore's estate plan. It also stated that the house remained Margaret's residence, and any arrangements made without her consent carried no authority. That evening, Margaret returned to the street where she had lived for most of her life. The taxi stopped beside the familiar curb, and she stepped out slowly, the evening air carrying the soft rustle of leaves through the branches of the tall maple tree. The porch light was already on. Daniel stood near the doorway holding the letter, his expression uncertain as Margaret walked up the steps with calm, steady movements. Ashley remained inside the living room, visible through the window, but silent now. Margaret reached the porch and paused for a moment beside the railing Edward had painted every spring. She did not raise her voice or speak with anger. She simply looked at her son and said that a house built over 36 years deserved respect, and that decisions made in haste often revealed more about people than they intended. The door opened quietly, and Margaret stepped inside. The familiar hallway waiting exactly as she remembered it, while the evening light faded gently across the quiet street outside.